The Iceberg Hermit by Arthur Roth. Copyright 1974. For Jackie, Frank, Mike, and Alexander. Chapter 1. "Masthead there! Look sharp, blast your eyes!" the captain roared. High on the lookout point on the main mast, 17-year-old Alan Gordon steadied himself and looked down. The captain and the first mate, two black dots far below on deck, were looking up at him. Alan watched the captain turn to the first mate and say something. Then angry voices rose again on the still, cold air. All around him Alan could hear ice scraping against the wooden sides of the Ann Forbes. He blew into his mittens, trying to warm his hands. The fog seemed to get inside his clothes, making him shiver. He put his hand into the pocket of his jacket and felt the small Bible his mother had given him when he left home. She had made him promise to read a page every day. So far he had only missed once, the day they had caught their first whale. In all the excitement he had forgotten his promise, but he had read 2 pages the next day to make up for it. Alan had long ago decided that Captain Hughes was a liar and a bully. He shouted at everyone on the ship. Only Big Tom, the first mate, would stand up to him. But the other men, and Alan too, kept quiet when the captain began to rant and rave. Captain Hughes was the sort of man who was looking for any excuse to place a sailor in irons for mutiny. That way the captain and the ship owners would have one less share to pay out when the ship reached Aberdeen, its home port in Scotland. This was the year 1757, when sailors led a very hard life on their ships at sea. Alan peered ahead into the whitish mist. These were iceberg seas, and he had to keep a sharp lookout. Now and again he would catch an angry word from far below as the captain and mate continued their argument. The captain's bullying voice made Alan think of Crab McAfee, an old retired sailor who used to spend hours talking to Alan about life in the British Royal Navy. Crab had gone in the Royal Navy when he was only 12. Once Crab told Alan about the bullying midshipman on one of the men of war who used to stand on the yardarm and stamp on the fingers of young boys as they climbed to his level. One day the midshipman fell, and his fall was seen by a dozen boys aloft in the rigging. They swung their hats and cheered the body all the way down to the deck. The doomed midshipman hit with such force that his leg bones were driven up into his body. For a moment Alan imagined the short, squat body of Captain Hughes falling from the main mast, turning over and over in the air before it hit the deck. It was one way to get rid of a hated sea captain, but unfortunately Captain Hughes never climbed up into the rigging. Through the still and windless air, Alan heard the 2 men arguing below him. "I don't like this fog rolling in," the captain shouted. "Aye, we're paying for your stubbornness," Big Tom answered. "Oh, we'll come out of it," the captain said. "I've sailed through worse than this. It's late in the season and we're still far to the north. We should have come about a week ago." The captain said nothing. For the past week the first mate had been insisting that they begin the long voyage home to Scotland. Their whaling ship, the Ann Forbes, had spent the summer between the north of Greenland and Spitzbergen, along the edge of the polar ice cap, chasing whales. Early in the season the ship had fallen in with a large school of whales that the captain had followed to the north, sailing ever deeper into the Arctic seas. Big Tom, an experienced whaler, kept urging the captain to turn about. He had never seen the sea that clear of ice so far north before, and he knew how suddenly treacherous the polar seas could become. Many a whaling ship had been caught in the ice and never heard of again. But Captain Hughes was a stubborn man, and a greedy man, and he kept sailing north until the holds were almost full. Then one day, just after the whaleboat crew had lashed yet another whale to the ship's side, the captain suddenly grew alarmed. He ordered the fires under the trypots put out and the huge iron kettles lashed down. It was time to run for home. The last whale was hauled up on deck, and for the next day or two, as the Ann Forbes was underway, the men cut the whale up into chunks of blubber that were packed away into barrels. The blubber from that last whale could always be melted down when the ship reached port. But several days after hoisting sail, the Ann Forbes caught a northward current and made very little headway. Even worse, the polar seas were beginning to freeze over. Soon the vessel was surrounded by bobbing ice floes that every day grew more thick and numerous. To add to their troubles, a heavy fog lay over the water. The mate guessed that the fog meant the nearby presence of an iceberg or large ice field. He had seen those Arctic fogs before. He knew, too, that whaling ships were sometimes trapped in the ice all winter, and when that happened, the crews of such ships usually died from the cold, or from hunger, or from the dreaded sickness known as scurvy. And those were slow and painful ways to die, with none of the swift mercy of drowning. Now the ice floes were closing in on all sides of the Ann Forbes. Even Alan Gordon, high up on his lookout platform on the main mast, could hear the scrape of ice against the wooden sides of the vessel. Alan peered into the fog. On all sides he could spot cakes of ice bobbing past. As far as he could see, the water was dotted with ice floes of all shapes and sizes. Several times he spotted a large ice island, where dozens of ice floes had frozen to each other. But Alan was not worried. This was his first whaling trip into the northern seas, and he did not realize the danger. High up on the mast, he thought only of his return home. With fair sailing weather, they could make it back to Scotland in a couple of weeks. It had been a good voyage. Their holds were full, and Alan would make more money from this one trip than he had in 3 years of fishing. His mother would be pleased. Alan's father was dead, and they needed the money at home. He would also be able to buy a nice present for his girlfriend, Nancy. Despite the cold and fog and ice, Alan was happy to be a whaler. He was in excellent health, making good money at an adventurous job, and he had already traveled more and seen more sights than most people did in a lifetime. What 17-year-old lad could ask for more? Alan had signed on the Ann Forbes 4 months before, entitled to a full seaman's share of the profits from the voyage. In those days, a seaman could make more money from whaling than any other kind of sea duty. The work was hard and dangerous, but it paid very well. Whale oil was in great demand. Before the discovery of crude oil, people burned whale oil in their lamps. Whalebone was used in ladies' garments, while perfume and cosmetics were made from other parts of the whale. Although Alan was only 17, he had already worked 3 years on fishing ships in his home port of Aberdeen. In those days it was common for 12, 13, and 14-year-old boys to go to sea. Alan had worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a tailor in Scotland before he went to sea. So he was well used to hard work. He was a strong, well-built youth who stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 160 pounds. He had blue eyes and straw-colored hair and a tiny cleft in the point of his chin. Around Alan the canvas sails flapped lazily in the odd breeze the ship caught. As usual with fog, there was little wind and the ship was making slow headway. Suddenly Alan came alert. For a moment he thought he spotted land ahead. He knew the Ann Forbes was not far from the North Greenland coast, and it was possible that an uncharted island lay in the vessel's path. He lowered his head and narrowed his eyes as he tried to peer through the fog. But he could make out nothing. The afternoon light was failing, and it was hard to see ahead for any distance. But there! Now it loomed in front of him, a solid greenish-white wall of ice. He turned and shouted down with all his might, "Berg! Dead ahead! Berg! Dead ahead!" Down below, Captain Hughes yelled a command to the helmsman. "Hard a-port! Blast your clumsy claws! Hard a-port! Port! Port!" The Ann Forbes slowly began to turn to port, but it was too late. The ship hit the ice almost head on, a heavy smashing blow. Both mate and captain were thrown to the deck. The crash whipped the top of the mast forward like the tip of a fishing rod, and Allen flew from his lookout post. He hit a sail below and clutched at it desperately, but his mittened fingers could not get a grip. He half slid, half fell, down the sail until he hit a spar. The blow knocked the breath from him, but he had sense enough to hook one arm under a rope and hang on. After several moments of just hanging there, he managed to pull himself up and onto the yardarm. Then he looked down. Spars were snapping off with such fury that they sounded like gunshots. Sails hung sideways, all fouled in the rigging. Already one mast had crashed on to the deck. Allen picked his way to the very end of the yardarm. There, some 20 feet below, was the flat surface of a ledge on the Iceberg. Between the wreckage of the crippled ship and the smooth, hard surface of the ice, Allen chose the ice and dropped from the end of the yardarm. This time the force of the fall knocked him out. On board the Ann Forbes all was confusion. The ice wall against which the ship was pinned gave no foothold to anyone. The ship had started to sink, and an attempt was being made to lower one of the whaleboats on the sea side of the vessel. The whaleboat no sooner reached the water when a large ice floe smashed it to pieces against the side of the Ann Forbes. Bodies spilled into the sea. Other ice floes began to build against the seaward side of the ship. As the Ann Forbes settled lower in the water, large blocks of ice rode in over the side, forcing the vessel to list even more until the seawater came pouring in over her gunwales. All the sailors were now up on deck, desperately trying to save themselves. Some threw hatch covers into the sea and jumped in after them, hoping to use them as rafts. Quite a few had climbed the rigging, but with the tilt of the ship to seaward, they had no hope of reaching the top of the ice wall, and were now simply hanging on to ropes and spars. Captain Hughes had gone down to his cabin to snatch up the ship's log and other valuable papers. Big Tom, bracing himself against the slope of the deck, looked around at all the others. There was a slight smile on his face. The desperate efforts, the panic, the scurrying to and fro, the captain trying to save the log, all of this seemed senseless to the mate, for he knew too much, knew they were all doomed, knew that the men who had jumped overboard would only last minutes in the freezing water, knew it was only a matter of time before the Arctic claimed another 50 victims. He looked up in the rigging, wondering what had happened to Alan Gordon. He felt a wave of pity for the 17-year-old youth out on his first voyage. Alan was nowhere to be seen, and the mate decided that he must have been thrown into the water and was no doubt drowned by now. "Get it over with," Big Tom muttered to himself, then ran down the sloping deck and dived cleanly over the rail to his death in the icy waters. Above on the ice field, Alan Gordon groaned, then forced himself to sit up. He was just in time to see the top of the ship's mast disappear from sight. The Ann Forbes had gone down in minutes, with all hands, and Alan was alone on a field of ice, somewhere off the coast of Greenland, with no food, no water, and no hope of rescue. Alan looked around. Nearby there were some dim white shapes that he knew to be ice boulders, but they were the only things to be seen. Everywhere he looked there was fog and ice and piercing cold. He felt a desperate loneliness, as though he were the only person in the whole world. Without food, without water, with no way of keeping warm, he was doomed. Death would come in a matter of days, perhaps even hours. It was so unfair, he thought. In one moment he was a happy young man on his way home to his family and girlfriend with plenty of money honestly earned, and the next minute he was sitting all alone on a piece of ice in the middle of the Arctic seas, waiting for death to come. He got to his feet, staggered over to one of the ice boulders and sank down behind it, trying to find some shelter from the cold. He wrapped his arms around his sides, hugging himself, and began to sway back and forth. "I'm going to die," he said aloud. "I'm going to die right here, all alone, and no one will ever know about it." He thought then of his mother and of his 3 younger sisters, Jean, Flora, and Gladys. They would wait for word of the Ann Forbes, and as the months and then years passed, they would learn to accept the fact that Alan was dead. And wee Bunty Duff would finally be right about Alan. However, if the schoolmaster were right, then the old fortune-teller had to be wrong. Thinking of his mother, Alan reached a hand into his pocket and took out the Bible. There was just enough light to read his daily page. When he was finished reading, he carefully marked his place in the Bible with a thin, flat piece of whalebone that he used as a bookmark, then put the book away in his pocket, and thought that in his present situation, saying a prayer was about the only possible way he could help himself. But he had little faith that prayer would save him either. Squinching down into his clothes as much as possible to keep warm, he sat there and waited for the end. Chapter 2. No matter how he tried, Alan could not sleep longer than a few minutes at a time. If it was not one thing, it was another. The noise of a piece of drift ice smashing into the side of the ice field would jolt him awake and leave him trembling with fear. Or his feet would get too cold and start to throb with pain. Or the heat of his body would melt the ice he was sitting on, and the melted ice water would soak into his pants and force him to move to a new place. He thought the night would never end, though he realized that the coming of daylight would hardly improve matters. Again and again during the night he went over his situation, and each time found it hopeless. He discovered that the ice around him was frozen seawater and not fit to drink. As for food, even if a seal or some seabirds came to the ice field, he had no way of killing them. And if by some miracle he found food and water, without fire he could not last very long in the bitter cold of the Arctic winter. He had survived drowning, only to die from starvation and exposure. There was only one very slim chance of rescue, that within the next day or two a passing ship might spot him and take him off his ice island. But the Ann Forbes had been late in turning about for home, and all the other whaling ships had no doubt left the polar seas by now. And even if one of the whalers were still in the area, the chances of that particular ship sailing close enough to the ice field to see him were 1 in a million. The dawn came and Alan stirred himself. The fog had finally lifted, a day too late for the Ann Forbes. He stood up and looked out over the frozen ice field. The first thing he noticed was a tall mountain of ice some 100 yards away. Looking at that ice peak, he felt the first stirring of hope. It was obviously an iceberg, and icebergs he knew were originally made of frozen snow and therefore had no salt. With fresh water from an iceberg, he could survive for 8 to 10 days, perhaps even 2 weeks. During the night he had tasted a chip of ice and found it salty, but now he guessed that the unbroken ice field that stretched away as far as he could see was made of frozen seawater that had trapped the freshwater iceberg in its grip, like a raisin on the surface of a cake. Alan turned slowly around until he was looking at the spot where the Ann Forbes went down. Then he rubbed his eyes and looked again. It was still there, a long, rounded black hump frozen into the ice. Surely it was the carcass of a huge dead whale that had somehow broken loose from another whaler and drifted until it froze into the edge of the ice field. A miracle, Alan thought, as he ran and stumbled over the ice. Suddenly he had a mountain of fresh water and more food than he could eat in a year. When he reached the scene, he found an even greater miracle than he had dared to hope for. What he thought was a whale carcass turned out to be the black upturned bottom of a ship. After the shock wore off, Alan realized that the ship had to be the Ann Forbes. He could hardly believe his good luck. A moment ago he had neither food, water, nor shelter. Now he had all three. With some difficulty Alan made his way over to the Ann Forbes. Everywhere the ice was all jumbled up and hard to climb over. He found a broken piece of spar that had been thrown onto the ice when the ship went down, and used it as a staff to help him over the rough places. Finally, he reached the keel of the vessel, only to be frustrated again. How was he to get inside the amphorbes? The keel and bottom of the ship was made of thick oak, and he had nothing that would cut a hole through the tough wood. He was in danger of starving to death with a ship full of food only a few feet away. Then he remembered the captain's cabin at the rear of the vessel, a cabin with a small window that he might be able to squeeze through. If he could dig down through the ice and reach that window, he could crawl through and into the cabin. Once inside the captain's cabin, he would have shelter, and surely he would find some food. But how could he reach the cabin with nothing to break or chop with? By now, Alan had a raging thirst. His last drink of water had been the day before, and the piece of salt ice he had sucked on during the night had only added to his thirst. Before he could attempt to get into the amphorbes, he would have to hike over to the ice mountain. Even if he got inside the ship right away, it would not help him. Any of the water that was stored aboard in barrels would now be mixed with seawater and not fit to drink. Alan turned around and headed for the iceberg peak. Again, it was very slow going over the humped-up blocks and piles of ice, and he often had to stop for a rest. It took him over an hour, but he finally made it to the foot of the mountain. He knocked a chip of ice loose with his staff, and found, to his great joy, that the ice was free of salt. He drank until he was satisfied, knocking pieces loose and letting them melt in his mouth. After that, he remembered his promise to his mother, took out the Bible, and read a page. Alan looked up at the towering peak of ice above him. If there were only some way he could cut steps to the top of that mountain, he could see for miles. He could even put up a signal of some kind, a flag that might be noticed by a passing ship. At the moment, however, he had to return to the amphorbes and figure out some way of getting inside the ship. He knocked loose a large chunk of ice and jammed it into the pocket of his jacket so that he would have something to drink later on. This time Alan took what he hoped would be an easier way back to the amphorbes. Making his way through and over the jumbled ice, he had to take frequent detours to avoid knee-deep pools of slush or ice ridges that were too high or too difficult to climb. He had almost reached the ship when he spotted a pile of smashed timbers off to one side. He went over to investigate and found the remains of an open whaleboat that had been stored on the deck of the amphorbes. The whaleboat had somehow been thrown clear at the time of the collision. Although it was smashed beyond repair, what excited Alan was finding several articles tangled up in the wreck. He pulled out a couple of pieces of sailcloth, a coil of rope, an iron harpoon head, and the whaleboat's anchor. The anchor was shaped like the head of a pick, and he lifted it up in his hands, raised it above his head, and let one of the points come down on the ice. He grunted with satisfaction. It wouldn't be the easiest tool in the world to work with, but between it and the harpoon head, he ought to be able to chip away at the ice surrounding the amphorbes. Later, after half an hour's work, he stopped to rest for a moment. He figured that the captain's window was somewhere between 6 and 10 feet below the surface of the ice, which meant that he could not dig straight down, or he might not be able to climb back up and out of the hole again. He would have to start well back and dig an open trench that sloped down to the window. He still had trouble believing his good luck. During the night, the sunken ship had somehow turned turtle and been forced to surface again. Perhaps the air trapped in the holds was responsible, but the miracle would do him no good if he could not get inside the vessel. He jumped to his feet and went back to hacking at the ice. Several times he was tempted to give up digging. Even if he got into the ship, it did not mean that he was saved. Any food on the amphorbes would have been spoiled by seawater. He might live a week or two longer inside the ship, but in the long run he was doomed. But what finally stopped him from giving up was the memory of Bunty Duff talking to his mother that soft spring morning over 5 years ago. Thinking of Bunty made Alan tighten his lips and go back to smashing at the ice. Thinking of Bunty could have made him mad enough to do anything. When dark came, he still had not reached the captain's window. He spread a piece of sailcloth on the bottom of the trench, lay down and rested his head on the coil of rope, then pulled another piece of sailcloth over his face. Hoping to keep warm, he pretended he was sitting on his favorite stool in front of the fire at his home in Aberdeen. He thought he heard his mother say, "Alan, it's time to go to bed." She would lift the oil lamp down from the wall and wait until he climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft above the kitchen. There he would lie face down on his straw mattress and look into the kitchen through the wide crack between the floorboards. He would watch his mother tilt her head above the chimney globe of the lamp. A quick puff of breath and the flame would go out, leaving everything in darkness. Then he would turn over, link his hands beneath his head, and listen to the soft pitter-patter of rain on the thatched roof. And listening to the rain, he finally fell asleep. End of chapter 2.